It's my pleasure to welcome you to this timely panel with a highly experienced group of experts in the subject matter at hand. The topic we will be discussing is what roles can mediations and negotiations play in bringing about humanitarian pauses, release of hostages held by Hamas, release of Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli jails, and of course, the much sought after and talked about ceasefire in the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. Much of the media to date has focused, and I think rightly so, on the terrorist attack on October 7 that claimed the lives of 1,400 Israelis and kidnapping of 240 people, including elderly women and children, and the Israeli attack on Gaza that followed, that is still ongoing, and which to date led to more than 10,000 deaths, of whom are 40% are children, injury of thousands of civilians, wide destruction that leveled whole neighborhoods in Gaza, including targeting of hospitals and schools housing refugees. In addition, we have been seeing violence unfolding in the West Bank, the killing of more than 100 Palestinians in the West Bank at the hands of settler groups, and ongoing attempts by these same groups to force Palestinians out of their communities. Add to this the looming threat of the conflict expanding beyond Gaza, West Bank, and Israel to the region writ large, as military dynamics on the Lebanon-Israel border are moving at an accelerated pace on an upward escalatory path. While the fighting is ongoing and likely to continue for some time, there is need for talking and negotiations, and this is what the panel will be discussing. Joining me today is an excellent panel of experts in the subject matter. They are simultaneously scholars and practitioners in the field of conflict resolution, negotiation, and mediation. I won't go at length presenting their impressive bios. You can access them now, Google them. I will quickly introduce them and then move on to the discussions. And I'm proceeding in the introduction in alphabetical order. First, I have Mr. Sultan Barakat, Senior Professor of Public Policy at Qatar Foundation's Hamad bin Khalifa University, Honorary Professor at the University of York, and founder and director of the Global Institute for Strategic Research at the Qatar Foundation. I have also Gershon Baskin. He is Middle East Director of International Communities Organization, founder and former director of IPCRI, Israel-Palestine Center for Research and Information, and former negotiator between Hamas and Israel. And lastly, but not leastly, of course, Hiba Husseini, head of Husseini and Husseini LLC, a law firm based in Ramallah. She has been a legal advisor to Palestinian delegations in negotiations with Israel in peace talks, chair of the legal committee to final status negotiations between the Palestinians and Israelis. And last year, she and Yossi Beilin put on the table an interesting peace proposal, a new peace plan known as the Holy Land Confederation. Before we move into our discussions, one note to our audience. The Zoom question and answer function is open to submit questions to the panel. We will take your question in the last 15 minutes of the panel. We will try either to address them individually, or if there are too many of them, we are going to be grouping them into categories and addressing them to our panelists. So let's start. And I'm going to start with both Hiba and Gershon, starting with Hiba, and do what a typical discussion about negotiation and mediation start with, which is analyze the conflict. Where is the conflict today? What is the stage of the conflict? And where do we see heading it? Where do we see the conflict heading next? Hiba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Randa. Thank you for having me, and it's good to be here. And thank you for giving us this opportunity to chat about the negotiations the day after, because the situation on the ground today is extremely difficult and grim. And I'm glad that we have this opportunity to explore. Probably I would start with having immediate plans, as you started outlining with the ceasefire, then short plans for reconstruction, rehabilitation of Gaza. The humanitarian crisis is immense, so we need to look at that. And then what do we do in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, in terms of Palestinian statehood, end of conflict, and so forth. So if I were to sit down and with Gershon Baskin and plan, let's say, the negotiations as a first step, assuming that, as I said, the ceasefire has taken place and the humanitarian crisis is being dealt with under a massive reconstruction plan for Gaza, and of course dealing with the Gaza envelope settlements issues and the prisoners. We're assuming that prisoners also have been released. We're assuming that the northern front of Israel, along with being the southern front of Lebanon and the Golan, the Golan Heights, are also under some sort of ceasefire, some sort of hudna arrangement. And now we're discussing, so where do we start, Gershon? We start with the assumptions. And the assumption number one is that we are here to discuss Palestinian statehood. We are here to discuss Gaza, West Bank, geographical connectivity. I mean, the isolation that Gaza has been under for the last 17 years and the lack of progress on the peace process for the last 30 years is what got us here today, along with, of course, all the issues related to Jerusalem and the holy sites in Jerusalem. So we start with assumptions that have been already agreed to. And in a way, the Oslo process has to be retired. The Oslo process has, we injected so much oxygen into it, but I think it has really expired by now. And no amount of oxygen that we pump into it can revive it. So what are the alternatives, and how do we deal with each other? I think we come to the realization that both Israelis and Palestinians are here to stay. Israelis and Palestinians are not going to get rid of each other. Palestinians and Israelis somehow have to share this land. Now, of course, we have, we start from having to agree on borders. We have to agree on the relationship. We have to agree on what to do with the settlements, how to swap the settlements, how to deal with the respective populations, and so forth and so on. And so if I were to start my Palestinian parameters, I would say, okay, indeed, we are going to start from 67 borders, but how do we shape those borders today? And how do we address the borders? And in a realistic way, that would give us a contiguous state, that would give us room to grow and develop as a Palestinian population. And how do we address which settlements would we be swapping? And how do we define all of that? Then, of course, what we need to do next to that is how to deal with all the security arrangements for both people, and how to deal eventually with, the refugee population, and how to address the parameters of Jerusalem and the neighborhoods. So this is where I would start, with the parameters, basically.
Okay. Gershon, so take us a little bit, I think Hiba is already into the negotiation. Take us a step back a little bit and tell us, share with the audience, where is the conflict today from your perspective in terms of political dynamics?
Okay, I won't go back 100 years and I won't even go back 75 years, but I will go back 14 years, since 2009. And of course, the conflict didn't begin in 2009, it began way before that. But I want to relate to the last 14 years, I guess it is, when Benjamin Netanyahu came back and took control of the Israeli government. He has been the prime minister for most of the last 14 years, with the exception for just under 2 years. He designed a strategy in almost unspoken partnership with the Palestinians that brought us to where we are today. And it's important to understand. Netanyahu made a speech, a very famous speech at Bar Ilan University, in which he's declared his support for the two-state solution if the Palestinians met certain conditions of recognizing Israel's right to exist. In fact, his father, Professor Ben-Zion Netanyahu, was interviewed the following day on Israeli army radio on Galei Tzahal, in which he said, "I know my son, he didn't mean it." And of course, his father was correct. Netanyahu had no intention of implementing a two-state solution. In fact, his strategy was the strategy of separating permanently the West Bank and Gaza, of leaving a weakened Hamas in power in Gaza, and an illegitimate Palestinian Authority, illegitimate in the eyes of most Palestinians, for reasons of increased corruption, for reasons of not fulfilling any of the political goals that they said they would fulfill, for reasons of not holding elections. Mahmoud Abbas, with all due respect to him on a personal level, I like the man, but he's in the 18th year of a 4-year term. So we have to face reality that if there's one thing that almost every Palestinian I know agrees on, it's that they need to have new elections and elect a legitimate government. Well, Netanyahu's strategy worked so successfully that he had, on the one hand, a regime in Gaza that was dedicated to Israel's destruction, which he kept in power and enabled it to be funded by Qatar. He kept in power a decreasingly legitimate Palestinian Authority in Ramallah that cooperated with Israel on security coordination, and for most Palestinians was viewed as a subcontractor of Israel in protecting settlers and not protecting Palestinians. And we erased the Palestinian issue from the global agenda. The international community kept mumbling the mantra of two-state solution, but did nothing whatsoever to advance it. All these states, like the United States and the OECD nations, who to this day mention the two-state solution, never bothered to recognize the state of Palestine or to grant Palestine membership in the United Nations, which albeit would not level the playing field, but it would transform negotiations from the occupier, the occupied, from a state, an organization, into some kind of international framework that we could deal with on a better level, a state-to-state level. He removed the Palestinian agenda from the Israeli elections. We had 5 rounds of elections in Israel where the Palestinian issue wasn't even mentioned. It was off the agenda. And everyone accepted the narrative that we have no partner. And the Palestinians were all too cooperative with this narrative and never challenged it in any way to wake up the Israeli public to the reality that exists on the ground, which was the continuing of the occupation. Now, Israel has been living in a delusion for 56 years that we can occupy another people and expect to have peace, or occupy and lock up 2 million people in a territory with Gaza with 80% poverty and expect for there to be quiet. There was also a delusion in Israel amongst our military that we could deter Hamas, that Hamas could be deterred. From 2008, the Israeli-Gaza war in 2008, I've been saying in Israeli television stations sitting next to retired generals that we cannot deter Hamas. Hamas is, I believe, a distorted understanding of Islam, which is based on the idea that our life on this world is short, and what we seek is paradise, and the entry to paradise is by being shaheed, by being a martyr for Islam, for Allah, for Al-Quds, for Al-Aqsa, and to get revenge. Hamas Nukhba force, the elite force of Hamas, has worked on a strategy of recruiting youth from bereaved families in Gaza. After every round of violence with Israel, they went house to house to every bereaved family. They went to every home that was demolished by Israel and recruited the youth and told them, you need to grow strong and be dedicated to Palestine, to Allah, to Islam, to Al-Aqsa, and to get your revenge. And then you will get paradise. And against that kind of ideology, you cannot have deterrence. Hamas has dictated when they fight, how long they fight, and when there's a ceasefire. Israel has never been in control of any battle between Israel and Gaza. It has always been Hamas that dictated it. In fact, in the last 2 years, Hamas was so smart that they made Israel think that they were ready to be pragmatic and have long-term arrangements with Israel. They sat out 2 rounds of warfare and allowed Islamic Jihad to shoot rockets at Israel while they did not. They studied Israel with microscopes, understanding Israel's security. And they knew that over the last decades, the Israel Defense Force was no longer a defense force, it was an Israeli occupation police force. More than 30 battalions of the Israeli army was stationed in the West Bank to protect settlers, not to defend the borders of Israel. And when Hamas penetrated the border of Israel and Gaza with the ease that it did, this became an existential threat for Israel. And when we're looking at the disproportionate use of force by Israel in Gaza, the extensive bombing and destruction, it's not only against Hamas and Gaza, it is primarily aimed to send a message to Iran and Hezbollah, don't mess with us. We screwed up in Gaza, but we are not weak. And what we're doing in Gaza is nothing compared to what we will do in Beirut. This is the message of what's happening in Gaza. And of course, as Hiba said, there's a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. 1.5 million people are homeless, again, having their homes and their lives destroyed. 10,000 people killed, most of them non-combatants, civilian children and women. And we have the horrific terrorist attack that took place across Israel's line. As you said, Rhonda, killing 1,400 people, burning whole families alive, killing children in front of their parents, doing the most horrific things. For me, as someone who's been talking to Hamas for 17 years, when they did that on October 7th, they crossed the line and are no longer worthy in my mind of existing as the government next to Israel. We cannot negotiate long-term arrangements with them. Now, my final sentence before we get to the next round is that Israel's primary mission from day one until today has been to dismantle Hamas's ability to continue to govern Gaza and threaten Israel. That's a mission which is achievable at a very high cost to human lives, to soldiers, to the army. It will take time, but Israel can go in and kill all the Hamas leaders and all the Hamas commanders and find their stockpiles of weapons. And it's really interesting that everything in Gaza has run out: food, water, electricity, medicine, but they still have rockets. Hamas has built this enormous network of tunnels underneath Gaza, but not one shelter for the Palestinian people in Gaza. But Israel can destroy this infrastructure. The only thing that Israel can't destroy with its military is an idea, the idea of Hamas, the ideological basis of Hamas. And the only way to defeat an idea and an ideology is with a better idea and a better ideology. And we'll talk about that in the next round when we talk about what I call the day after tomorrow.
I think Hiba started us with good proposal about the day after that I would like to pick up, and have her elaborate on in the next round. But before we get to the next round, let's move to Sultan. Negotiations need mediators, right? Need interlocutors. Sultan, you heard the perspective of Gershon. You heard what Hiba is putting on the table as proposals. So I would like you have had really intensive involvement over the years in negotiations with the Taliban, between the US and Taliban, that were housed in Qatar. And you are in Qatar. So as I said, scholar practitioner, in the field, which is the most important, in my opinion, mix. So tell us, where are we? There are hostages that have been released, thanks to Qatar mediation. There is supposedly a deal in the making to release more hostages with humanitarian pauses. So where are we in that space?
Great. Well, good evening, and thank you so much, Randa, for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel. I agree very much with what was said by Gershon and Hiba, but if you allow me just 1 minute to maybe make slight adjustments to the argument. Number one, which is really important, is that Hamas, as far as we know, never sought to govern Gaza. Hamas revolted against the PA's attempts to prevent them from resisting occupation. That's very important to keep in mind. They saw the governance as an additional burden. They were not good at it. They don't know how to do it. And I don't think they ever really sought it. What they were after is the freedom to resist, which the PA was denying them in 2005 and 2006. That's number one. Number two, the Israelis, when they started blockading Gaza, they started before Hamas came to power. And in fact, their actions against the Palestinian administration in those days, in 2005, 2006, is what encouraged Hamas and then led to the population kind of stand by them, because they were getting suffocated slowly in those days. And of course, back in those days, they never imagined that this will continue for so many years and will get worse and worse and worse year on year. The second issue to remember when talking about Hamas is that they have genuinely, I think, wanted to become more pragmatic under a lot of pressure. Some of it was maybe exercised here in Doha after they moved their head office to Doha, which resulted in 2017 in them revisiting their original charter. The original charter, as you know, did not distinguish between Jewish and Israeli. The new does. The new discussion also, the new charter that they tabled also somehow recognizes the 1967 border and the right of Israel to exist, not in as many words, but implicitly it talks about Israel as a neighbor, two states, and so on. Now, all of that was not rewarded in the sense that they were not embraced as part of the discussion politically. Instead, we had war after war. As Gershon rightly put it, it's all Netanyahu, I think, is implicit and is implicated in all of these attacks and wars that happened, a series of them. So where are we today? In Qatar, as you know, ever since 2006, Qatar was approached by everyone to try and open a channel of communication with Hamas. But this channel became really active or hyperactive after Mishal left Damascus, and he left Damascus at the height of the Arab Spring, when Hamas couldn't make up its mind whether they're going to stand with Assad or they're going to stand with the people. They felt, I think, torn between the government that has given them so much support and accommodated them, and the population that is also sharing their cause. You know, they're looking for freedom and so on. So their answer was to withdraw from Damascus. And again, the international community discussions that were going on at the time were focused on what would happen to Hamas. Where would they go? Jordan has already expressed no interest in hosting them back in Amman. And the only option on the table was Tehran. And Israelis, as well as the Americans and everybody else, really feared the scenario where Hamas head office would be in Tehran. Now, moving forward, they were brought to Doha, but a year later, the elections took place, and Haniya was elected. Mishal is no longer the leader. So, in effect, the leadership of Hamas moved back to Gaza. And that was an important step when the Mishal and others were here really reflecting and thinking about the new charter and what could happen. This has meant that over the years, Doha has become an indispensable channel of communication with Hamas. We had many wars and many reconstruction efforts that followed, reconstruction under siege that required a mediator. And this is what the Qataris ended up doing throughout, mediating between the Israelis and Hamas. And despite the fact that they had no diplomatic relationship with Israel, everyone knows that they had very good relations in the sense that they had channels of communication. I think they were relatively trusted by the Israelis, and the money that went to Gaza never was channeled directly. It was all channeled through Israel. You cannot channel money directly into Gaza, and even the subsidy that goes to the civil servants, which was as a result of a discussion between the PA and Hamas and trying to resolve the conflict between them, all of that goes through banking systems that are monitored and observed by the Israelis. And on the reconstruction money, they also take a cut to allow the money into Gaza. So there was no surprises that suddenly Doha would become the place to communicate. The surprise came on the 7th of October when Netanyahu denounced Qatar and any country that had connection with Hamas. And that was the part of his position, that he took a zero-sum position on that day, that Hamas must be finished and it should not exist. There will be no talks and so on. And that has created the first barrier for mediation, if you like. A few days later, that statement was reversed by his national security advisor, and he talked about the role Qatar can play. And I think then Qatar, the United States, Hamas, everybody else wanted to show their ability to deliver. And the first two hostages were released, the Israeli-American ladies, the mother and the daughter. They were released, I think, as part of a goodwill gesture by Hamas, number one. Two, they were released also to show that the leadership in Doha does actually communicate and have connections and can exert influence on the Qassam brigade in Gaza. And this is again important because since 2014 and the release of Sinwar from Israeli prison, there has been, I think, a little bit of rift developing between the political wing and the military wing of Hamas. And often you hear rumors that they're not listening, they're acting on their own and so on. And I can maybe 99% say that the political leadership had no idea about the 7th of October. That when it was triggered by the Qassam. So all of these issues were happening almost simultaneously, all these dynamics taking place at the same time. So when it came to mediation, the first two were let out. The second were very much a gesture to the Israelis, that we still have the will to negotiate, and we are able to access those hostages and let them out. The difficulties arose as a result of the Israeli position. Netanyahu's zero-sum has not changed. He insisted that he continued to do the most outrageous bombing campaigns, totally illegal crime under any definition of international law. And he is insisting on that. And his position has been that we will not stop until these people are released. The approach I think Hamas is taking is more of a problem-solving approach. Their whole objective from when they launched the exercise or the attack on the 7th of October was to capture prisoners, to capture soldiers in order to exchange and to please Sinwar and to meet his promises to those he left behind in the prisons of Gaza, of Israel. He left about 5,000. By now, I think Israel has added 1,500, maybe 1,800 to them. And he has made a promise to these people that his cause is going to be their release. The reason they went in on the 7th of October was simply to capture soldiers in order to trade them for those prisoners. Now, we can talk maybe about what happened and the chaos and the way it ran out of control later, but if you like. But they look at it as a problem-solving issue. They think they have something to trade with. Netanyahu has nothing to trade against for that. And I think we reached a gridlock in the sense that they're not seeing eye to eye. What is the only positive thing that happened? If you recall, at the very start of this, Hamas put on the table the possibility of executing the prisoners. And they said that if you continue bombing, we will start executing prisoners. Now, luckily, they withdrew that. At least that is not part of the discussion at the moment. But they are presenting a very legitimate position that Netanyahu is killing the hostages. That now, by today, I think the numbers that they've reported as having been killed is just exceeded 60 people. 21 of them are not accounted for under the rubble, but 40 they're sure that have now been killed in the same bombing campaign. And what makes this really problematic, I think, for the Israelis, is that many of those individuals, Israel managed to locate them geographically, following their phone signals. And no one understands why Netanyahu insists on continuing to bomb, knowing that Israelis are in those locations. The only justification, I think, is that maybe for him, dead Israelis are easier to manage and to try and cleanse the problem that he has caused than hostages. And you could see this in terms of the pressure that the families of these hostages are building up in Tel Aviv. The other important aspect, and I'll stop here, is that from Hamas perspective, we started talking about 240 people kidnapped. They don't see them like that. There are soldiers amongst those, there are policemen that they've captured, and there are people who were reservists, who off action, but they're reservists amongst those that they captured. And what they put on the table, again, as a gesture of goodwill, is that all the foreign nationals, they'd be happy to let go as soon as a safe corridor is created by the Israelis. So we're in a position where there are really two sides that are not yet seeing eye to eye, and they're pursuing very different objectives at the moment.
Thank you, Sultan. Gershon, let's pick on what Sultan has mentioned in terms of the hostages release. I've seen a tweet you have put out recently saying that if the Israeli government fails, and I'm paraphrasing here, to focus on the hostage release, that's going to have long-term impact on the society, on the fabric, on the societal fabric of Israel, that Israel will never heal from. So pick up on this point, and based on your history negotiating again between Israel and Hamas, what are the roadblocks right now in Israel?
Sure. I did write that if Israel decides to sacrifice the hostages, this would be a damage to Israeli society that I'm not sure that Israel's society will be able to heal from. That's how serious it is. Whereas at the beginning of the war, the primary objective of the Israeli government and the Israeli people was to dismantle Hamas's ability to continue to rule the territory next to Israel and threaten Israel. Today, the saving of the hostages is on par with that first goal of dismantling Hamas's ability to govern and control. These are two contradictory goals, and they obviously can't be achieved parallelly. If Israel wants to bring back all the hostages alive, all of them, including those that Hamas defines as soldiers and policemen, and all the hostages in one time, the only way to do it is for a negotiated agreement with Hamas. The only agreement with Hamas that's possible is meeting the promise that Sinwar made on the day he was released in 2011, and has made in every important speech since then, that he will free all the prisoners in Israel. The all-for-all deal is the only way that Israel can bring back all the hostages. As far as I can tell, no Israeli government that exists today will be willing to make that deal. We are dealing with around 7,000 Palestinian prisoners. 559 of them are serving life sentences for murdering Israelis. Many of them are serving multiple life sentences, plus 130 of the terrorists who were caught inside of Israel on October 7th. 30% of the prisoners are members of Hamas. Only about 400 of the 7,000 come from Gaza. The vast majority come from the West Bank. Of course, the majority of them are not serving sentences for killing Israelis, but for things like belonging to a terrorist organization or throwing stones or Molotov cocktails. There are 2,000 of the 700 are administrative detainees. In other words, they were arrested by Israel without charge and imprisoned without trial. So there are possibilities for this kind of release, but I can't see any Israeli government accepting it. There are three channels of negotiations going on right now in parallel. There's the Qatari track, there is the Egyptian track, and there is another track that the Americans opened up in Beirut. These are taking place in parallel. Some of them are being coordinated. For the most part, they're not. Whereas I agree with Sultan that the first two women, the Ra'anan, mother and daughter, who were released as a gesture by Hamas. More, I would say they were forced by the Qatari government to release them because of direct American pressure of President Biden and Secretary Blinken, who even mentioned their name. But something really strange happened a week later, or less than a week later, when two other women were released, First, Abu Ubaidah, the spokesperson of Al-Qassam, put out an announcement on their Telegraph page that two women would be released. They gave the names. One of them was a misname, but they put their Israeli ID numbers. And when this Telegraph announcement was put out by Abu Ubaidah, I contacted people from the political wing of Hamas, both in Gaza, in Beirut, and in Doha. And first of all, they knew nothing about it. 20 minutes later, Abu Ubaidah put out a corrected version of the announcement because the first one said that the mediators were Qatar and Egypt. And 20 minutes later, they put out an announcement that it was only Egypt. The night before, the Egyptian intelligence officer in the Egyptian embassy in Tel Aviv called me at midnight and asked me for the phone number of the head of the office of the International Red Cross in Tel Aviv. It took me about 10 minutes to find that, and I gave it to him. And of course, the next day, when these two Israeli women were released, I asked him if it was a connection. He said, of course, this was our work, the Egyptian intelligence. Now, the two women who were released by Israel were not American citizens. They had no other nationality. They were Israelis. And they were released by Qassam, not through some other channels. And in my mind, this was simply a competition between Egypt and Qatar, who could do a better job. Quite frankly, I believe the Egyptians are much more qualified to do the negotiations with Hamas. I believe that they do have direct lines. I know that they have direct lines with Qassam underground in Gaza, whereas the people in Doha are sitting in their villas and living a life of luxury and speaking on behalf of the suffering people of Gaza, who are detached from reality, in my mind. And Ismail Haniyeh and Khalid Mashal, and even Sinwar's deputy, the number 2 in Gaza, Khalil Haya, ran away as in sitting in Doha. In my mind, if I were a Palestinian, I would tell these people to go to hell. They have no right to speak on behalf of the suffering of the Palestinian people who are being bombed by Israel and sitting in luxurious Qatar. Not only that, excuse me, with all due respect, Sultan, in my mind, Qatar is a state that supports terrorism, and they need to be called to order. If I were the United States, with all the U.S. interest in Qatar, the CENTCOM base, so the largest American military base in the region, is in Qatar. So America has deep interest there. But I think enough is enough, and the Americans need to tell Qatar, if you don't force Hamas to release hostages, you are going to be exiled from Qatar. And if you don't do that, we are going to label Qatar as a state that supports terrorism. With all due respect to Al Jazeera English is BBC. Al Jazeera Arabic is a machine of poison supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. Qatar has funded Hamas directly with more than $1 billion over the years. And the negotiations of Qatar by Mr. Mohammed Ali Mahdi were never at the high level in Israel. In fact, when this war began and I was in contact with Mohammed Ali Mahdi, the Qatari envoy, and through my colleague in Paris, we were talking directly with him. The highest level contact that he had in Israel was with the coordinator of government affairs and territories, who's a Druze officer. He wears an army uniform, but he is not in the position to negotiate on behalf of Israel. We connected the Qatari deputy foreign minister with people sitting in the war cabinet in order for them to negotiate. But the real negotiations, I believe, are in Egypt and not in Qatar. I don't think the Qataris can deliver. I don't think the Hamas leadership in Qatar can deliver. They're talking about a ceasefire now. This is the Hamas demand for a humanitarian release of women, children, elderly, sick, and wounded. And I'm very specific when I say this. We're not talking about civilians. Hamas will not treat the women soldiers as women. They're treated as soldiers, and I think this is wrong. but they want a ceasefire in order to make progress. Israel's not granting a ceasefire now, and I think it's very difficult for them to do it, even though they should, because a ceasefire means not only stopping the fire now, it means redeploying, withdrawing. The soldiers are now in the center of Gaza. They're surrounding Gaza City. They're in a vulnerable situation. They can't just stop because Hamas won't honor a ceasefire. It's doubtful that Israel will honor a ceasefire. So we're at a very dangerous juncture now, where the Israelis are about to enter the tunnels. They have uncovered lots of entry points of the tunnels. I believe that Hamas has full control all over the hostages after 1 month now, not Islamic Jihad and not the Popular Front or not individuals, but Hamas is really in charge. They have a special unit for hostages. And the time clock is ticking on whether or not there can be a negotiated release of hostages. We may get to that point where Israel says no negotiation is possible, and Israel will go after the Hamas in the tunnels, and then the hostages are going to be sacrificed. Maybe some will be rescued. Most probably will be not. One word, additional word, and then I'll stop. The announcements about hostages being killed by the Israeli bombs and all, it might be true, it might not. My advice to everyone with regard to hostage negotiations at any time is don't believe anything that anyone says about it. It is all part of the negotiation. Everything that's said is psychological warfare. It's meant to influence the negotiating process. Everything that's not said, all the fog around the negotiations is part of the negotiations. So we should be very careful about what we hear and what we believe and what we say.
Hiba.
Can I just come back very quickly?
Hiba, yeah, but let me move to Hiba. Hiba.
Okay.
So how can we go from here, to the day after? You have put some proposals on the table. So what needs to happen now? What needs to happen in the next few days to get?
Well, I mean, against this difficult analysis that we just heard, and I agree with all of it, by the way, and that's why it's so complicated to move forward. But I think we must move forward. There must be some voices that can, first of all, the PLO cannot do this alone, and the PLO cannot move into, and the PA, of course, cannot move into Gaza immediately once a ceasefire is announced. Even because they will be seen as legitimate in Gaza as well, and they will be seen as riding on Israeli and American tanks. The US, in the eyes of the Palestinians, is seen as a full partner of Israel, enabling the killing of children and women. I mean, and this is the public perception in the West Bank as well, in East Jerusalem. And so forth. So we need to overcome.
And it's true, Hiba. It's not just a perception. It is true.
It's true. It is. Yeah, it's true. So to overcome the propaganda war, the warfare, the psychological warfare, the tit for tat, and the fact that Hamas and that no one will negotiate with Hamas at a political level. Remember, of course, you have the PLO, Fatah al-Hamas, have not reconciled yet, and it's very unlikely to happen. So, what entity will be representing the Palestinian people, and what legitimacy it will have, and given also the difficulties that Abbas faces in the West Bank, and the fact that he is seen as an illegitimate representative of the Palestinian people, not because of the elections only, but because of the what Gershon said. I mean, the PA has been the instrument by which Israel maintains security to a large extent. And now Israel is moving, the Israeli forces are going into the refugee camps. I mean, the entire West Bank today is sealed, pretty much sealed. The cities from each other. I mean, it took me 2.5 hours just to get back home today from Ramallah. So, I mean, just to give you an example of how difficult things are. So, where do we start assuming a ceasefire, and these difficult issues have been to some extent not resolved, but brought under some sort of scenario where we can start a discussion. I think first, number one, it's very important to recognize that there has to be Palestinian agency, and Palestinian agency is the PLO, regardless of the weakness of the PLO today. So we have to empower them, because we cannot say that Israel is going to reoccupy Gaza. That is not going to will not work. And Hamas will not be sitting at the table negotiating with the Israelis, and the PLO cannot do it alone. We have seen that. So you need the Arab states, you need Jordan, you need Egypt also, because there's this tremendous worry, and it's legitimate about the fact that there might be a population transfer, and the call for the population transfer, not just Gazans into Egypt, but also West Bankers into Jordan. All of these fears are genuine, and can potentially become, if the situation is not managed to a point where we sit down and talk and provide the horizon, which is very much needed, can be very explosive. But again, so we need the Arab states at the table. We need Israel at the table. We need the PLO at the table, and the US has to get its act together in terms of how it will overcome this role that it has been serving in as the full partner of Israel and allowing the mass killing of Palestinians in Gaza. I don't know, but this is a challenge for the US, and they have to figure it out, but they have to do something about it. And we need to deliver, because everybody is saying, Biden is saying two-state solution as a lip service. Palestinians don't believe him, and they don't believe the US, and they don't believe Israel. Now, there is discussion that Netanyahu will not be there the next day. This is how it's seen. And his government, this extreme right-wing government that got Israel where it is today as well, and the statements that we get about using nuclear power against bombs against the Palestinians in Gaza and all of that. I mean, this is just, fuel to the fire, adding fuel to the fire. All of this propaganda, psychological warfare has to be put under the lid so that we can pave the way to move forward and start planning. We need a transitional phase in Gaza. We need some sort of a transitional authority in Gaza in order to get us with all these players that, the immediate Arab states, immediate, I mean, in terms of Egypt and Jordan. I don't know Saudi Arabia's role. I don't know Qatar's role. All of these roles have to be figured out. The EU, also the EU is seen as a very, very biased partner. I mean, Germany, France, UK. I mean, and they're also partners. They're sending armament and tanks, and they're sending missiles, and all of these all the weaponry. The chaos that is surrounding us needs to settle somehow in order to. So I suggest as we calm the chaos down and the dust, we need to have a parallel track to move in with sober minds, who are able to sit down and discuss the day after. And the day after has to deliver within milestones and a timeline, recognition of the state of Palestine in order to fill in all the gaps. Without that, this situation is going to get worse and escalate.
Now, quick question, before I turn to Sultan, quick question. With this parallel track, do you see it more as track 1.5, unofficial, or sanctioned by the different, parties, Israeli-Palestinian or Israeli-Palestinian regional? So what is
Randa, bilateral will not work. Yeah. It has to be probably 1.5, because I don't think Abbas and Netanyahu are going to sit down tomorrow at a parallel level and start a discussion. So 1.5 parallel and not Israeli-Palestinian alone. I mean, the animosity, the anger, the emotions are so high at this moment. I mean, the exchanges in the room are going to be explosive. The two are not going to sit down together and speak rationally. But it cannot be track one at this moment. It should get to track one once the dust settles and we see, what's going to happen post Netanyahu. But we must pave the way for this transitional authority to come in and deal with the mess in Gaza and to de-escalate the situation in the West Bank.
So this is not something that the UN can convene, but maybe it's something that, an international organization can convene that has access to all these parties along with the regionals, correct? That's what.
Well, the UN. I mean, because what we have to do is also divide roles. The UN has a humanitarian role. I mean, you have to have also a Red Cross, Red Crescent. I mean, they're already on the ground. The Red Crescent is already on the ground. So you have those who will be delivering the humanitarian aid are already there, and they need to be probably at some point in the picture because they're going to be coming out of Gaza. We don't know what's going on in Gaza, other than from what's coming from the media.
Yeah. Okay. Sultan, you have been now patient, and no, I mean, I wanted to give enough time. Yeah, I know you wanted to respond to something Gershon said, which is fair, but also I want you to address a question which was put to us by the audience, and it builds very much on what Gershon said in terms of these parallel tracks of mediation, negotiation that are taking place, Lebanon-based, Egypt, and Lebanon-based, I'm assuming, Gershon, with Hezbollah, correct? With people around.
No, it's actually Amos Hochstein, the American Jew who negotiated the sea border between Lebanon and Israel, and he is in contact with Abbas Ibrahim, the former head of intelligence in Lebanon. And Abbas Ibrahim went to Doha a few days ago. So it's somewhere along those lines, but probably with Salah Arori also from the military wing of Hamas.
Okay, thank you. So there was a question asked, okay, what about Saudi Arabia? What about Jordan? What about Turkey, especially Turkey? I mean, what is their role there in mediation? Sultan, the floor is yours.
Well, first, in terms of, I'm not here to defend Qatar, but the accusation about Qatar supporting terrorism, this is an old story. And as you know, Qatar went through blockade by its neighbors for many, many years. There's been extensive investigations into all this and came out on top because they turned out to be the ones that observed best international law. And this is the problem also in them assuming this mediation role. The best chance for any deal to sustain is to have it legal. What is going on at the moment is terribly illegal. So before we even start talking about the day after, today, the bombing must stop. The killing of civilians, no matter who you're after, should not happen. Those who supply the weapons to the Israelis are complicit in this and their partner in it. What is worse, I think, is not just about the killing of the Palestinians. I mean, now the official figures from the Ministry of Health have passed 10,000, which is more than what is being killed in Ukraine in almost 2 years of war. But Israeli sources talk about 20,000 because they also include the many thousands of young men that they've killed inside Israel, those who went in, either Hamas or the many, many hundreds that went in out of excitement because they, for the first time in their life, they broke through the fence and they went out. Now, the real threat is in escalation and drawing all these regional powers into conflict. I think the United States is being blindly led by Netanyahu for a confrontation with Iran. And he's not going to stop until he has applied his vision, which he has tried to sell ever since he was done with Iraq. You know, there's been a lot of propaganda about Iran. You remember his days in the UN with the bomb and all that business. This is the closest he managed to get the US to confront the Iranians. And he's poking Hezbollah. Now, we can say who is to blame on the borders, but Israel has the power because they're not equal powers. They have the power to restrain themselves They can choose how to respond, and they did not have to kill civilians in South Lebanon. He is going after them. He is poking them. He is insisting on widening the circle of this issue. And what gives him the energy, I think, is this, for us, amazing biblical belief that he seems to drive him. The man is not operating under the international law that was laid out as a result of the First World War and then the Second World War in 1945. He has a 3,000-year-old law that is linked to the Amaleks and what happened in those days that justifies for him killing everybody, including the hostages. And this is what really I think the Israeli public should worry about. He is absolutely not interested in releasing those people, because these people will go after him for his double failure. First, for not securing the Israelis, then for, as you rightly said earlier, distracting the whole Israeli defense forces into West Bank to meet the objective of his right-wing extremist views, and also for continuing to confront Hamas over Al-Aqsa Mosque. Hamas made many threats before. And, only as recent as May this year, there were jihad missiles that were thrown out, and Hamas, as Gershon put it rightly, kept out of it. Now, we have to worry about this. So this is number one step, has to stop this absolutely illegal, crazy massacre that is taking place. Regardless of what happened, you cannot continue killing hundreds of kids in the name of catching Hamas. The second, which I think is on his mind as well, he's probably trying to do the Beirut scenario again. He must believe, and I don't know who put this idea in his mind, but he must believe that Hamas can be evacuated from Gaza. So the future of what will happen is he will probably put on the table for the Hamas, after he's pressured them to a certain level where they have no escape, that he would be willing to provide for an international evacuation for Hamas fighters to go somewhere in the world. I'm not sure where they end up, in return for a ceasefire. But all of these scenarios that are talked about by Netanyahu are crazy. First you have to stop the killing. And if you are thinking and this is what he's already done, he's sliced the north of Gaza. I think he should just focus on that. If you're after the tunnels, just deal with the tunnels. Why are you dealing with the middle and the south part of Gaza, where the people that you've warned already to move to the south, these are the people that are being killed. So focus on what you're doing in the north. You've already cut the north from the south. The most likely scenario, I think, in the day after is that he will occupy the north of Gaza again and will be part of negotiated settlement in the days to come. He will turn it into a security zone so that he pushes the Palestinian as far as possible from Ashkelon and Tel Aviv, so that they don't have the range in the missiles. And then we would have by then created a major humanitarian crisis in the 2/3 of the area that they used to live in. And we worry that the international community then, motivated by genuine humanitarian concerns, will put pressure on Egypt to open the borders and implement the population transfer. And if he does this, then there's no point about talking about future state. There's no discussion about politics. And this is why I think the first thing to do, and this is, I think personally, I was most encouraged by the Not in My Name movement in the United States. I think this is the first time that Jewish Americans stand up to Israel, and I hope that they continue. And the only answer, the only solution is in their hands. It's only when they are able to influence the lobbyists in Washington that we will see any prospect for a genuine, just solution for the issue in Palestine. I hope that.
Yeah, I have to give the floor to Gershon here, and just answer me the question. You said that ceasefire is not in the cards now, right? It looks like it. So what's going to make it happen? Is it President Biden saying enough killing, it's done, we have to stop here, as has happened in previously when, American president had to step in, like 2006, and basically tell the the Israeli generals, That's it. We stop. We move to the UN Security Council and we negotiate an end. So is this something that is going to happen?
I don't think so.
Okay.
The way that I see it, we're not in another round of warfare between Israel and Hamas. This is a decisive round. For 17 years, Israel has been saying we're going to bring Hamas down. It was always a slogan. Everyone knew it was a slogan. It was never real. Now it's real. There's no scenario in my mind that I see happening on the ground where Hamas is able to govern at the end of this round of warfare. Yahya Sinwar and Marwan Isa and Mohammed Deif, if he really exists, and other commanders of Hamas have no escape route. They first of all, they would refuse to go anywhere. They will not surrender. There is no Hamas surrender. They will fight to the death, and they're not afraid to die. All the Hamas people that I've spoken to in the last month have said this very clearly. We're not afraid to die, and I believe them. Death is not what scares them. I think that Sinwar is committed to his goal of releasing all the prisoners. I don't think that goal will be achieved. I don't think that Netanyahu wants to kill the hostages, as Sultan says, but I think that a good chance that many of them will be killed. Some of them will be rescued. I don't see the United States pressuring Israel to end the war until Hamas is dismantled from its ability to continue. There's no scenario in my mind where there's a government called Hamas or run by Hamas after this war. And we don't really have time to get into the scenarios. I think that there's a whole lot of things that need to be done. I don't call it the day after. I call it the day after tomorrow, because it will take more time before the dust settles, as Hiba said. But it involves reconstituting a legitimate Palestinian Authority after elections. It involves the Palestinian Authority security forces taking the lead on a multinational Arab force, as was done in the Taif agreement in Lebanon to put an end to the civil war there. It involves an international commitment to force Israel to the Palestinian table and recognizing the state of Palestine and validating the two-state solution again, which has been off the table for so many years. It involves a massive amount of international aid. It involves negotiations where the Americans are not leading them, because the Americans destroy peace negotiations whenever they participate in them. They cannot lead the negotiations. It has to be regionally focused. I agree 100% with Hiba. It cannot be bilateral Israeli-Palestinian. There is no symmetry there that allows the Palestinians to have a fair say at the table. It has to be regional. We have to build a regional architecture for security and stability and economic development and energy and water and all this other stuff together, supported by the international community. The Saudis have to be there, and the Emiratis, and of course Jordan and Egypt have a major role to play. Palestine has to be united as West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. There are 3 Palestinian individuals who I think have to play a key role simply because of the legitimacy that they bring to the table. And that's number 1, Marwan Barghouti, who must be released from prison regardless of what happens with hostage negotiations, because he is the most important Palestinian figure in the mindset of the Palestinian people. Mohammed Dahlan, who's responsible for 90% of the aid getting into Gaza today, and he is from Gaza, he's from Khan Yunis. I'm sorry, this is just part of the reality. You can say whatever you want about Mohammed Dahlan. He will play a key role in the future of Gaza. And the other person who I think is important is Nasser al-Kidwa, who the nephew of Arafat, who was a leading Palestinian diplomat.
What's important is to give chance to the rising stars, the new.
No, I agree 100%.
All the ones you've named are burned.
I know they're part of the old school, but I think in the transition period, we need to look at some of these people as well. At the end of the day, the Palestinian people have to choose their leaders, whoever they want.
Right. I have to bring this to an end. You know what? I promise we are going to have a second one, right? So this is the beginning, hopefully, of a series of conversation with all 3 of you that we can continue, on a regular basis. So I thank you very much. I thank the audience, and I promise we are going to do another panel to build on what we have discussed now and move it to the next level. Okay. So thank you again, everybody.
And
thank you, Randa.